Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our November webinar. My name is Craig Latham, and I'm the Executive Director of NERI. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, #Cyber Offenses, Trending Topics in Assessment and Treatment of Cyber Offenders, presented by Elizabeth Griffin. Before turning this over to Elizabeth, I want to take a few moments to tell you about NERI Press. Our mission is to share current research and best practices emerging in our field. For many years, we accomplished that mission only through book sales. But with changes in the last several years in the publishing and technology worlds, we now disseminate knowledge in several additional ways. Over the last 6 years, NERI Press has also offered online courses, a free monthly newsletter, in-person trainings, and these webinars delivered by our internationally recognized authors and other experts in the field. It's important to us here at NERI Press and Training Center to hear what kinds of information, training, resources, and books you want, so please contact us with your suggestions, questions, and feedback, whether positive or negative. Now, for our information, how many of you have participated in a NERI Press webinar before? Jonathan, can you launch the poll, please? All right. So we're getting some votes coming in. That's great. I'll talk more about this at the end of the webinar, but I'd like to make the pitch that if you find these webinars helpful, we hope you'll consider becoming a sponsor of our webinar series. Like Car Talk on NPR, it's your sponsorship that helps make this series happen and allows us to offer our webinars for free to the thousands of clinicians and other professionals who have participated in them over the last several years. Please consider becoming a sponsor of this webinar series. If you become a sponsor now, you'll get guaranteed seats to all webinars in the 2018-2019 season. We will register you and 15 staff members of your organization for each webinar, offer you a free gift of 2 NERI Press books, and mention you in all of our publicity about the webinar series and at each webinar. Before we get started with Elizabeth's presentation, there are a few more things I'd like to share. First, I want to let you know the learning objectives for this webinar. Participants will be able to identify specific assessment tools helpful when evaluating individuals who committed online sexual offenses, discuss concerns and issues related to assessing risk in individuals who commit online sexual offenses, and identify specific treatment issues and helpful treatment interventions for this population. Second, I want to let you know that the YouTube recording from this webinar, as Jonathan mentioned, will be posted on the NERI Press website by November 20th. Slides are currently ready to download from the NERI Press webinar page at neripress.org/webinars if you'd like to follow along. As Jonathan mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, you can also download the slides right here from your control panel on the right side of your screen. Third, when the webinar is over, please answer the short survey at the end. We would love to have your feedback. And finally, in about a week, you will receive a follow-up email with a link to the recordings and to a certificate of attendance that you can download. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Elizabeth Griffin is a licensed marriage and family therapist with over 30 years experience treating individuals who've committed sexual offenses. She has worked in outpatient, inpatient, military, and prison settings. Ms. Griffin lectures nationally on the assessment and treatment of sexual offenders, especially individuals who've committed online sexual offenses. She has written numerous professional articles on these topics, and she is the co-author of 4 books. Ms. Griffin is the founder of Internet Behavior Consulting. Please join me in welcoming Elizabeth with a virtual round of applause.
Everyone today. I want to draw your attention to the website address at the bottom of the screen, internetbehavior.com/cyber offenses 2019. That is a web page that I have set up that will have a lot of resources on there for you. Feel free to share it with colleagues. It will be up for all of 2019, and it will have many of the articles and treatment assignments that I referenced today. So to get started, I'd really like to talk about some of the theories about online sexual offending. And this comes out of Michael Cito's book, which if you treat this population or do assessments with this population, it's a great book to have. It is called Internet Sexual Offenders. And in the book, Dr. Cito talks about 4 somewhat theories about online sexual offending. One theory is that it's just another version of contact sexual offending and there's not anything really different about it. Another theory is that online sexual offending is really associated with problematic internet use, that people start to use technology, have access to so much material that is sexual in nature, and oftentimes discover child pornography or discover chatting with adolescents. And so it's really a result of not understanding the dynamics of technology. Another theory is that it's associated with the factors of sexual compulsivity and hypersexuality. And then finally, some people believe it's a completely new form of sexual offending that requires the development of new models to think about it in terms of assessment and treatment. And the reality is, it is all of these things. So one of the things that we really talk about in assessment is that you really need to figure out which camp or which theory your client fits into. Because I've seen clients that really can fit into each of these theories of sexual offending online, and based on where they fit is really going to direct your treatment needs. So we'll talk about that throughout the presentation today. I want to talk just a minute about language. You'll hear me say the words child pornography offender quite a bit. I'm really trying to change my language to child sexual abuse image offenders. The belief in the field is that when we throw around the term child pornography, we really don't stay grounded in what's really happening in these images and videos, and that's the fact that children are being sexually abused. So you'll hear me kind of switch back and forth between those two terms. Also in the field, I've started to see more and more people talk about child sexual exploitation material offenders. I personally like child sexual abuse image offenders as the title I'm trying to go to, and I do think it's important that we help our clients understand that as well. So the focus today is really going to be on child sexual abuse image offenders. There's also a subgroup of online sex offenders, the solicitation offenders. Those are people who often travel, typically to meet adolescents or chat in chat areas with adolescents. But today we're really going to focus on child sexual abuse image offenders. And at the very basic level, they're broken down into people who view child sexual abuse images, who trade child sexual abuse images, and or produce child sexual abuse images. You'll also see in the literature that people will talk about this group as individuals who are fantasy driven only. So they really have no desire to try to meet and be sexual with an actual child, versus some of the child sexual abuse image offenders that their goal is to really have contact with the child. Again, from Cito's book, he really breaks down that research indicates there's just not one reason why people start looking at child sexual abuse images online. It can be accidental. 30 years ago, when I first started in this field, if someone came into my office and said they had accidentally got child sexual abuse images, they would have been laughed out of the room, because 30 years ago, that just wasn't possible. But today, depending on where you are in the online world, it is certainly possible to get these images accidentally. We do know that at times people are curious. Oftentimes we see 18, 19-year-olds who start looking at images of 14 and 15-year-olds because they don't feel very sexually experienced, and they get online looking for adolescents and come across images of younger kids or adolescents, so they're curious. For some people, they're hypersexual, and they often start, the typical story is that they started looking at adult pornography, they became very compulsive or hypersexual with their adult pornography use. And the reality is, if you look at enough adult pornography in the online world, you are going to come across child sexual abuse images. And for some people who become so desensitized to pornography in general, they start to gravitate towards some of the more extremes and disturbing forms of pornography, such as child sexual abuse images. For some people, we know they're pedophilic, that they have sexual interest in prepubescent children, or they're hebephilic, which is sexual interest in pubescent children, children who are just starting into puberty. And that interest really drives them to look to technology to find those images. For some people, we know they're collectors, and they may be collectors because they're pedophilic or hebephilic, but they also may be collectors because some of their mental health issues. I had a case out of California, and he had one of the largest collections of child sexual abuse images that have ever been recorded in the history of California. And while part of it was related to pedophilic interest, the size of the collection was more related to his diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder and some other mental health issues. He also had the largest collection of cat videos anyone had ever seen, and the largest collection of videos of cars. So it was more than just being pedophilic or having some pedophilic interest. It was also about his mental health issues. And then, of course, some people, and this is the smallest group that we see in treatment or in the court system, are people who are commercially making child sexual abuse images and using them to trade for other material or using them for monetary gain. So before we talk more, about assessment issues and some of the questions we have about child sexual abuse image providers, I just wanted to spend a minute on a new field of psychology. In the literature, it's called the psychology of the internet. And really, in this day and age, we should probably call it the psychology of technology, because we're broader than just the internet these days. But it really talks about that when we're anonymous, and this comes from the social psychology research of the 60s, that when individuals feel anonymous, that we do and say things we wouldn't normally do or say. A good example is when a college wins the Final Four basketball championship, and students like at Duke University, which is a very prestigious university with kids who are very bright and have a lot of opportunities afforded to them, that they, go out in the streets and start fires and damage property. And it's because of that feeling that I'm in a crowd and I feel anonymous. So the technology, even though we know on one level we're not anonymous, can make us feel very anonymous. Also with technology, it feels like it's just a fantasy. It's all in my head. It's just a game. There are no rules, so I can do anything I want to in the online world or with technology, and there are no consequences to my behavior. It's also a place that's easy to escape. So when you're somewhere with technology and you want to leave, you've done something that all of a sudden maybe you realize you shouldn't be doing, you just click an X and it just disappears, or you just press a button. So it feels really easy to escape out of trouble, and in that moment, there are no consequences for what you just did. And it also feels like that everyone's equal and just a friend on the internet. So if someone suggests that you go look at child sexual abuse images at this website, I do it all the time, it's no big deal, then people oftentimes will engage in that behavior without completely understanding the ramifications. We do know from research that there's a phenomenon called digital disinhibition, and it creates this unique environment when we're online and decreases our ability to think of consequences. The research has shown that when all of us are online, it impairs our ability to be empathetic. And we know that technology can facilitate sexual offending through what Al Cooper called the AAA engine: accessibility, affordability, and I just blanked on the third one. So I was just trying to think of them, just blanked on it. I'll come back to that. Accessibility, affordability, and anonymity. Those are the three. So because of that, we all do or say things in the online world that we might not do in our offline world. So we are going to talk about child sexual abuse image offenders, and we're really going to first look at the two major questions. So the first question that everyone always wants to know is, do child sexual abuse image offenders have histories of a hands-on contact offense? And if we really look at the research, there are a number of studies out there, and they range everything from 7% from a study out of New Zealand to the infamous Butner study in 2008 out of the prison in North Carolina. But if you really look at the studies and you get rid of the outliers, so you get rid of the 80% and you get rid of the 7% and the 10%, and you really average it all together, what it looks like, or what we think at the moment, is around 39 to 40% of child sexual abuse image offenders have a contact offense in their history. And that may be a contact offense we know about or one that we don't know about. And there was an FBI study done in 2016, and they looked at a lot of cases in the federal system, and it came out about 39% looked like they had a past a contact sexual offense in their history. So it's important to remember, you'll see that not everyone does have a past contact offense. Probably the majority, at around 55 to 60%, do not have a history of a past contact offense, but a significant number do, and we can't forget that as we look at assessment and treatment issues. The second question we have more research on: are child sexual abuse image offenders likely to have a hands-on offense in the future? And what we know is that research is demonstrating that child sexual abuse image offenders tend to be lower on the major criminological factors, such as past criminal history, antisocial personality features or traits or personality disorder, lower on substance abuse issues. However, they score higher in the areas of sexual deviance. So many of the clients we see in the system for child sexual abuse images often do have some degree of sexual interest and or arousal to prepubescent children. However, they're still lower in risk than someone who has a contact sexual offense. And CEDAW calls it the motivation facilitation model, that many of the child sexual abuse image offenders have the motivation, so they have some deviant interest, but they don't have the facilitation factors, which are those criminological factors, such as a past criminal history, antisocial personality traits, or substance use, problems with authority. So I think that's important to remember, that we are going to be looking for deviants in this population, but even with deviants, they're going to be typically lower in risk for a future child pornography offense or a future contact sexual offense because of not having those criminological factors. Because the research really demonstrates that it's both of those, the major criminological factors and the interest in deviance, that is the deadly combination for risk. The other things that the research are telling us is that child sexual abuse image offenders are more likely to have previous pro-social lives, so they have a lot of the protective factors. Oftentimes they have jobs, they have done well in their communities, they, have some of those factors that we look for resilience. They do have oftentimes more interpersonal and affective deficits, meaning they have oftentimes depression and anxiety and struggle managing those. They have higher levels of sexual preoccupation and fantasy. So they do tend to be hypersexual for some of those, and they use sex as coping. They do pretty well on community supervision because the research is saying they're significantly less likely to miss treatment appointments or drop out of treatment or fail in the community as compared to contact sexual offenders. So why do we need to assess the risk of this group? Why do we need to look at each client individually when we know that a lot of these clients are low risk? Well, we need to do that because of the risk principle. So the risk principle is from Andrews and Bonta, and what it really says is that high-risk clients, high-risk sexual offenders, need high-intensity consequences, supervision, and treatment. And if we don't give high-risk individuals those things, then they will get worse and be at a higher rate of recidivism. The reverse is true also, that if you take someone who is low risk and you give them high intensity consequences, supervision, or treatment, they actually get worse as well and become a higher risk for sexual recidivism. So a lot of people feel like that for some of our child sexual abuse image offenders, we are over-treating and providing consequences that are not appropriate with their risk level. And that by doing that, we're actually increasing their risk for sexual recidivism, not decreasing their risk for sexual recidivism. So when we look at risk assessments and how do we assess this group, what we know is that the existing risk assessments, such as the static 99R, cannot be used for this group because they were normed on contact sexual offenders, and it typically overestimates the risk for child sexual abuse image offenders. Now, obviously, if you have someone who is in the system for child sexual abuse images, but you know that they have a past contact sexual offense because of previous legal difficulties, previous charges or convictions, then you can use a static. But for the group of individuals that are in the system for child sexual abuse image offenders and we don't have a history of a prior contact sexual offender, you can't use the static 99. The Risk Matrix 2000 has been modified that you can use that with child pornography offenders. Not a ton of research, but it has been used, and the research that has been done says that it does fairly well in predicting risk for this category. Michael Cito and Angela Eek developed the child pornography risk tool, and they clearly would say that it should anchor your thinking and not be an absolute predictor of risk, because this group, the child sexual abuse image offender, has such a low rate of sexual recidivism, it's been difficult to develop a risk tool that's accurate. In order to develop a really accurate risk tool, you need a large group of individuals who have recidivated. You need to see what were the factors that separated the group who had recidivism versus the group that had no recidivism. And because child sexual abuse image offenders, to our knowledge, have very low rates of recidivism, it's been really difficult to get an accurate risk tool. On that website, there is a link to the manual that Dr. Cito and Angela Eek have put out in terms of scoring the child pornography offender risk tool. It is in the public domain, so there's no cost to it. So we have put a link to that on the website that I referenced in the beginning. So as you look at the list of factors that are on the CPORT, you can see that many of the factors are similar to some of the factors we know are important for looking at recidivism in offline sexual offenders. So we know that if an individual is under the age of 24 at the time of the offense, that they tend to be higher risk. We know if they have prior criminal history or prior contact offending or haven't done well on conditional release, that they tend to be higher risk. And again, all of those factors are really trying to tap into those criminological factors. As part of this CPORT, they look at if there is an admission or diagnosis of sexual interest in children, and they develop the CASIC. And the CASIC is a separate screening tool that you can use when using the CPORT or when you have any individual who has been charged or convicted with child sexual abuse images, and really looks at how likely is that individual to have pedophilic interest. And so they look at if they've been married, if they have videos or stories related to child sexual abuse, if they've been involved in child sexual abuse for more than 2 years, if they're volunteering in roles that they have access to children, and if they're communicating with children in the online environment. And a score of 3 or more on this CASIC is an indicator that the person is more likely to have pedophilic interest. And again, in the scoring manual for the CPORT, they go into great detail about how to score those. The other 2 factors on the CPORT is, does the individual have more boy than girl content in the child pornography images? And do they have more boy than girl content in other child-related materials? So if they've been looking at swimsuits or going online to look at kids that would not be child pornography images. If it's more boy than girl, then that's typically a higher risk factor for recidivism than if the images were focused on prepubescent girls. So what we do know overall is that a large group of child sexual abuse image offenders pose a low risk. There's a small number that do move on. In the meta-analysis that Cito did, it was 2%. Faust did an analysis of the individuals who were in federal prison in 2009. A new individual, new sex offense, including a child pornography offense, was 5%. So we do think that overall this group is less at risk to move on to sexual offenses in the future. Slightly higher risk to move on to another child sexual abuse image offense, and less risky to move on to a contact offense. What we do know, if you're a dual offender, which matches everything we've talked about, so if you have a past contact offense and you have anything to do with a violent offense, combined with a child pornography offense, that does make you significantly more likely to have a future contact offense as you move through. So again, we want to make sure we're getting risk right, because if we don't get it right, then we can't provide the appropriate treatment services and we're increasing recidivism rates. I'm going to go quickly through this. In an all-day workshop, I'd spend a lot of time, but we obviously want to do a good clinical interview. We want to do psychological testing, such as the MMPI and the MCMI, to determine what mental health issues may be present, to determine the presence of antisocial personality disorder, traits or features. We want to do a risk assessment such as the CPORT or the Risk Matrix 2000. And while the CPORT can be only used to anchor our thinking, when you combine it with everything else, it can be very helpful. There is an instrument that David Delmonico and I developed along with two probation officers, Rick Parsons and Nick Hoya, out of Pennsylvania. And sorry, I thought I had a slide there about it. It is called the CAMI, and the CAMI is the Child Abuse Material Instrument or Inventory. And this really helps us look at the forensic evidence. If you can get access to a forensic report, or you're working with probation and they can get access to look at what the forensic evidence is, this is really helpful in determining risk. Because it's important to know, were there 30,000 child sexual abuse images and 100 adult pornography images, or were there 30,000 adult pornography images and 100 child sexual abuse images? While we don't want anyone to have child sexual abuse images, knowing that forensic evidence can help us determine, was it really more related to pedophilic interest or more related to hypersexuality, sexual compulsivity. So the CAMI is also on that website that I told you about. There's also an article that we wrote for Probation Magazine that really talks about scoring the CAMI. In terms of treatment, I've often had individuals complete the CAMI and then done a polygraph just based on the CAMI if they've been honest about how large their collection was, what ages was it focused around, was it focused more on boys versus girls. So the CAMI is really developed from what the research tells us are important factors to look at. Then also we want to do a physiological assessment. So that may be a polygraph to determine if there is a past history of contact offenses. That's really important, because if there is, and we can get some evidence, and we know that the risk level is going to be much higher than someone who doesn't have a history of contact offenses. We want to try to determine an individual's sexual interest. Currently, there are 3 products on the market: the ABLE screen for sexual interest, the affinity measure of sexual interest, and the look. I have all 3. I typically use 2 out of the 3 because it gives me more confidence in the results, but it really, basically what we're looking for is, do you have interest in prepubescent children? That is the main thing that I'm looking for when I'm assessing for risk. And then obviously there's the penile plethysmograph, or the PPG. Those are a little bit more difficult at times to have done during the evaluation process, and people are more likely not to have significant results on the PPG during the evaluation process. But if possible, if the polygraph and the ABLE affinity or look have contradictory evidence or something that doesn't fit, sometimes I look to the PPG to help me sort out arousal to prepubescent children. We also want to look at protective factors. I think that in a lot of these cases, the individuals have a lot of these protective factors, and we know that while risk factors increase risk, protective factors can decrease risk. So I think it's important that we look at, and protective factors can also be helpful in predicting success in treatment. So we want to look for protective factors and look for the strengths of the client as well. People always kind of want to know about treatment in terms of how do we determine whether it is appropriate to put treatment individuals who've committed child sexual abuse image crimes or individuals who've committed solicitation crimes online with contact sexual offenders. And there's a debate about that in the field. I would say overall, if you really look to the research about matching treatment to risk level, that in an ideal world, we would take our technology offenders who've only offended with technology in the online world and treat them separately than we treat our contact sexual offenders, because the treatment needs are going to be different. We're going to have low-risk guys mixed in with more moderate to high-risk guys. So overall, I kind of fall on the side that we need to treat them in separate groups. Now, that doesn't mean that always happens. I have a group right now that is a mixed group because I just don't have enough people to do 2 groups of technology-only guys. So, but keep it in mind as you look at treatment. We do know that the treatment issues for this group have started to pull from the literature. So we cannot call these dynamic risk factors yet, because dynamic risk factors are treatment issues that research has demonstrated that if we treat and they get better, then recidivism is decreased. So we don't have the research with this population to say for sure that these treatment issues, that if we treat them, it will decrease recidivism. And again, it's going to be a little hard to get that information with this population because we don't have high recidivism rates that we know about at the moment. But the literature has started to pull the treatment issues that we believe are going to be important to treat with this group. Emotional regulation, helping this group learn how to manage their anxiety and depression. We're seeing a lot of literature that talks about high levels of anxiety and depression among the group of child sexual abuse image offenders. We know that for a subset of child sexual abuse image offenders, they really struggle with social skills and intimacy deficits. So that's another area that we need to be focused on in treatment. As I talked about earlier, we know that many individuals in this group struggle with deviant arousal or deviant interest. Maybe it doesn't always reach the threshold of arousal, but there is oftentimes some interest in prepubescent children. And if we don't help our clients understand that, we do believe that this would be an issue that would increase risk. Online hypersexuality. So for some of these clients, they're hypersexual both online and offline. However, a number of them, their hypersexual behavior started once they discovered pornography in the online world. And so really helping them address their hypersexual behavior either through some 12-step groups can be helpful. If a person has had a long history of hypersexual online behavior, they oftentimes need medication to really get that and manage that, but really making sure we're addressing that treatment. Then to really help people understand problematic technology use. We're still not doing a great job in teaching people how to be healthy in the online world. I'm a big advocate for trying to teach children, started at a very young age, about how to use technology in healthy ways. And we tend to wait till they're in junior high or high school to have these discussions, and those aren't the best times. A lot of kids are already in trouble at that point. So with our clients, we really need to address technology use and give them skills for really understanding how to be healthy in the online world. Lots of states I know just say we're not going to allow individuals with sex offenses to have access to technology. And the reality is the courts are starting to strike that down. It becomes almost impossible to find a job or do many things that you need to do in life without having access to technology. So we're going to need to start helping clients do that. And then victim awareness. This isn't pulling really strong in the research yet, but I think most of us who specialize in treating child sexual abuse image offenders would say that we really need to help this group of clients to understand the damage that is done to victims who not only by the child sexual abuse that has occurred, but by their images being shared. So on the ATSA listserv last week, and I can't remember who the article is by, Jill Levinson sent out the article. I will make sure it gets on that website, but it was a great article about David Finkelhor's group. I'm sure the article is at the Crimes Against Children Research Center website, because this article was put out by David Finkelhor's group. And it really talked about the research they've done looking at the damage to children as they age, when their images have been shared and when the images of their sexual abuse have been shared online. And it was a great article. It can be very useful in treatment. Jill talked about how she, with her group, talked to her group and went through the article about what the victims said about the lasting impact of having their sexual abuse images put in the online world. So that can be a great resource, and I'll make sure the article also gets on the web page. So you can find some treatment ideas specifically for this group at another website that David and I created. Is internetbehavior.com/Therapeutic Toolbox 2017. We did an article for the ATSA forum, and we created, I think there are 5 or 6 treatment exercises that are specifically for child sexual abuse image offenders, really addressing problematic technology use and victim awareness. So I think I'm about out of time, and that works, I think, around the time frame that I need to be ending. So I'll take some questions at this time. I need to turn on my webcam, unfortunately. So hold on just a minute. Let me get that on. Okay.
Hello, Elizabeth. Thank you. That was fascinating and very informative. And we've got a bunch of questions for you.
Okay, great.
So first, I mentioned to you earlier that a number of our folks are child and adolescent clinicians, and they were asking for clarification on whether the studies you cited were about adults only. And I think that's true. Am I correct in thinking that?
That is true. You know, in the field as a whole, we don't have a ton of research about adults, but it's certainly a growing body of research. But there is almost zero information or research related to kids. I did reference the Crimes Against Children Research Center, and that group has probably done the most research about looking at kids and their online behavior. So I would definitely take a look at their website, because they're going to have some good resources for you on that website.
Great. Even in the absence of a lot of research literature, I think all of us as clinicians and as parents have been confronted with this environment where sexting and Snapchat are rampant. And we have adolescents who are in the throes of hormones. and are sending each other what would be legally considered pornographic images, naked pictures of themselves or somebody else who's underage. How do you think about that if you're asked to evaluate those kinds of cases by the court? How do you analyze those cases?
So David Delmonico and I did write an article on this exact issue, and unfortunately I don't remember the name of the article, but it is on sexting issues, and I'll make sure it's up on that website. But this really wasn't tons of original ideas. What we did is we looked at the research and the literature, and what does it tell us about who is low risk, and when is it a developmental issue, and when is it more of a high risk issue, and when is it look like it is really exploitive behavior that's starting to set a pattern for more dangerous behavior in the future. And so what we really found was there are markers you can start to look at in terms of if a juvenile has been into trouble with some delinquent behavior. Is this a juvenile who is really, versus a juvenile who's really immature and developmentally maybe not quite at their peer level, is curious about sexuality, is making some really bad decisions, but doesn't have those delinquency markers that would indicate that the behavior is really setting a pattern for exploitive behavior in the future. So I will make sure that article gets on the webpage, but we go through a lot of the assessment pieces for trying to separate those two groups.
Great. And before you move on, would you mention that web page again, please? One person asked that you repeat that.
Sure. It is internetbehavior.com/cyber offenses, all one word, 2019. And there is not a space. It's all cyber offenses 2019, no spaces. And if you have trouble accessing that site, Craig, is there a way that people can, is my email address available?
I think it's on the original slide, and that will be available with the handouts that they download. You
can certainly email me if you have any trouble accessing that site. I'll make sure you get access to it.
Great. Thanks for your comments about the kids, because I think all of us who work in the field have a sense that a 40-year-old who's looking at naked pictures of children is very different than a 14-year-old for whom that's a developmentally normative kind of activity, even though the grown-ups may wish he wouldn't. Someone also asked, is there a cost to using the CPORT and the CSAI? Are those free?
Nope. They're free. They're in the public domain, and on the website I talked about, there is a link to both the instrument as well as the scoring manual that goes with that.
Great. Good to know. Do you think about the risk needs responsivity model at all when you're talking about how to analyze treatment needs of people? You alluded to it when you talked about Andrews and Bonta. What would you think of the needs, the criminogenic needs of these guys who are a little bit higher functioning, it sounds like, less criminal activity? How would you begin to think about maybe a good lives model approach to these guys, or a risk needs responsivity approach?
So if we look at the research, I am risk needs responsivity and good lives. Those are kind of the two models I base my treatment foundation on. So if we look at that, mostly are low risk. One of the things, as I said earlier, at the moment, we don't have clear research to tell us exactly what the criminogenic needs are of this group, though we have research that's starting to say, here are the treatment issues. So that slide that really gives those treatment issues, emotional dysregulation, social skills and intimacy deficits, deviant arousal, problematic internet use or technology use, and then hypersexuality. Those are the treatment issues that are really starting to pull as issues we need to address. We just don't have research yet to say that if we address those issues, recidivism decreases. And that's partly because we don't have enough people recidivating in this group at high enough rates that we can really say what the criminogenic needs are going to be. So we at this moment we just have to trust what we have so far, and those are the treatment needs that are pulling, that we hope to someday have the research that says those are our criminogenic needs. And then if anyone's ever heard me present, I am super motivated with this group to use responsivity techniques, because oftentimes there's a subgroup of these individuals who are very bright, who can write beautiful assignments, and they sound really good, and yet they're not very meaningful to them. So often in treatment, you need to look to some different ways, experiential pieces. You need to look to some other types of responsivity treatment ideas to really determine how well they're doing in treatment.
Great. And could you remind us again, please, of the final percentage of offenders who watch child sexual abuse and then go on to commit a hands-on offense?
So I don't want to say this is final, because this little subfield of our work is very new. At the moment, the research, if you looked at all the research, would say that 2 to 5% go on to have some type of future sexual offense crime. On the lower end, probably 2 to 3% for a contact offense, and on the higher end, probably 5 to 7% for a child pornography offense. I will say that I think people who go on to commit another child pornography offense, it's probably higher than we know about, because it's a behavior that people can do and not be detected. So I do think there are higher rates of going back to look at child pornography again. However, there's no research at the moment to back that up. That's just a personal opinion.
Great. So it's important for us to keep in mind when we get a referral, whether the question is the future risk of looking at additional child sexual abuse materials or the risk of a hands-on offense. Those are two very different questions.
Those would be two very different questions, correct.
Great. Another question, could you remind us again, please, of what constitutes the AAA engine?
Affordability, accessibility, and anonymity.
Everybody really remembered that. They just wanted to see if you did.
I know. I was in my head. I was thinking, oh, why did they have to ask that? Can I remember that?
Well, one more developmental kind of question. If we're thinking about risk needs responsivities, I think many of us who worked with kids have come across autism spectrum disorder kids who get involved in looking at naked pictures of children, or even children engaged in sexual activity. Sometimes accidentally. It actually does happen, as you said. And like many things that they perseverate on, they're often running and maybe collecting huge numbers of these, just like they collect Yu-Gi-Oh cards or Magic cards. Right. Have you tried to treat any youngsters or adolescents with spectrum disorders?
I do not treat adolescents. I have treated a number of adults who have official diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. It really is a difficult group in terms of technology, because technology can be such a positive influence in their life and really help them build social skills and build other skills. And it is a population that's very vulnerable to viewing child sexual abuse images. So I don't have any magic answers for treatment. I have found that, oftentimes we have to figure out the best filters and monitoring systems we can for that group, and there needs to be a lot of accountability. I have found that with adults it's a little bit easier because they oftentimes do have some ability to make decisions about what's right and wrong. And if you can really establish the rules and help them understand the consequences and the impact to the victims, that can be very helpful. But it is a process and it takes a lot of patience. But unfortunately, I don't treat juveniles, so I really can't speak to just the kid part of it.
And one thing, whether it's adult spectrum clients or adolescent spectrum clients, the issue of understanding the victim's perspective is often difficult because
Right.
that's a fundamental aspect of the disorder.
Right.
And sometimes it's easier to teach them how to act in their own self-interest rather than because they are aware that it's going to harm someone else.
Right. Yes.
Even though we wish they had empathy, that's maybe asking a little too much for what their limitations are.
Yes, very true, very true.
Well, I want to thank you so much for giving us this incredible and illuminating talk, and I'm going to go into our little closing spiel here. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So, Jonathan, do we have our next set of slides for us? We've got our full lineup for the upcoming webinar season, which you can view here and also on our website, nerepress.org. We are also offering paid CE credits for psychologists and social workers for all the webinars in our 2018-2019 season. For details about how to obtain CE credits, please visit nerepress.org/webinars, where you'll find a description of our CE process. If you still have questions, you can email Kristen at klobish@nere.com. Nere Press also publishes a free monthly newsletter in which we discuss a new or controversial journal article or research paper and examine its implications for clinicians in the field. You are automatically signed up for this resource if you're attending the webinar, and we hope you'll find it useful. Please consider becoming a sponsor for our 2018-2019 webinar series. We're excited to begin planning a brand new slate of webinars covering new and crucial knowledge in the field, guided by you, our listeners. To our previous sponsors in the 2017-2018 series, thank you for your commitment to the Nere Press webinar series. We would like you to consider renewing your sponsorship for this year if you haven't already. When you sign up to be a sponsor, as our thanks to you, we'll send you 2 popular Nere Press titles, Current Applications and Current Perspectives, or 2 new books if you've already received these 2. If you become a sponsor now, you'll get guaranteed seats to all of our webinars in the 2018-2019 season. And if you sign up as an organization, your organization is guaranteed 15 seats. We will also do your monthly registration for you, and we'll publicize your name or organization on our website, in our publicity, and on each webinar. Sponsorship is $98 for individuals and $250 for organizations. If you're interested in being a sponsor, please contact us directly at info@nerepress.org or call us. Finally, thank you to our brand new 2018-2019 sponsors. You can see them here on the screen. They are organizations, agencies, and individuals. We would not be able to bring you these webinars without their support. If you like this webinar, you can see our previous webinars on our website at nerepress.org and on the Nere Press YouTube channel. It is possible to pay for CE credits for all past recorded webinars. Thanks again to Liz for a great webinar, and a huge thank you to all of you for attending. I'd like to say again how much we welcome your feedback, so please complete your evaluation form when you close out the webinar. Thank you and good evening.